Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and this is RegWatch by RegulatorWatch.com. Big tobacco is evil. This truth serves as the foundation for tobacco control policymaking across most of the world. Public health bureaucrats, politicians, and nonprofit health advocacy groups believe so strongly in the evil of big tobacco that they ostracize any person or group they deem to be advancing the interests of the tobacco industry. Perhaps big tobacco is evil. Combustible tobacco products are deadly, and for decades the industry lied to the public, marketed to children, and spent untold millions influencing public policy. Yet by branding big tobacco as evil, public health organizations like the WHO have egregiously marked vastly less harmful alternatives to smoking, such as vaping and snus, as complicit. Joining us today on RegWatch is Clive Bates, tobacco control policy expert and former director of Action on Smoking and Health UK. Bates believes tobacco control crusaders have baked into policy a principle of irreconcilable conflict between the interests of the tobacco industry and public health. Clive, thanks again for coming back on RegWatch.
Hi, Brent. It's great to be back. Always good to talk to you.
So you just published an article in Tobacco Reporter that really, quite frankly, is the single best analysis of public health's implacable position towards vaping and other tobacco harm reduction products that I've seen in the 5 years we've been covering this. You write in this article about the iron rule of tobacco control. What does that mean?
Well, basically, I was trying to establish, is there a governing idea, one principle that explains the way tobacco control function? I don't mean all of tobacco control. I mean a kind of mainstream body of opinion and approach. And basically, you could say, well, maybe it's reducing harm or reducing cancer, or maybe it's, trying to get rid of smoking, whatever. But actually, I lighted on something else, which is this idea it has its origins in Article 5.3 of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. But it's the idea that there is a fundamental and irreconcilable conflict between the interests of the tobacco industry and the interests of public health. Now, if you take that idea as the governing idea, it has a lot of explanatory power. It explains a lot of things that we see, bizarre things like, rejecting the experience of snus, or the demonization of vaping, heated and smokeless tobacco products. Because if they come from the tobacco industry, it means by definition, they have to be bad. They have to be irreconcilably conflicted with public health. So if you take that as your starting point, that industry can never do any good, will always be bad, its conflict is fundamental and irreconcilable, you start to see a lot of things take shape that explains what is going on.
Let's just take a quick look at the article. If you can maybe address that here, we've got it up on the screen. So it's 5.3 in setting and implementing their public health policies with respect to tobacco control. Parties shall act to protect these policies from commercial and other vested interests of the tobacco industry in accordance with national law.
Right. So that is the piece of text that is in the Framework Convention on Tobacco Controls, the famous Article 5.3. And I was around at the time that this was all agreed back in 2003, and it wasn't seen as anything particularly, spectacular. It's almost a statement of the obvious that governments should take care not to be overwhelmed by commercial interests. And that would apply to the oil industry in climate change and, pharmaceutical industry in, kind of healthcare. It's not a particularly remarkable thing. And don't think anybody thought it was at the time. It was just a good process point that you shouldn't allow yourselves to be captured. But what happened in 2008 is that principle was greatly extended in the form of guidelines to what Article 5.3 actually meant. And the principle in the guidelines is that there is a fundamental and irreconcilable conflict between the interests of the tobacco industry and the interests of public health policy. Now, that is a very different thing to Article 5.3. It's actually a finding of fact. It's saying that this is a permanent and irreconcilable war between public health and the tobacco industry. It means that there is no possibility of any situation in which the interests of the tobacco industry and public health are aligned, which I think they are in the case of tobacco harm reduction. The companies can produce much lower risk products, then people who smoke can switch to them, and that will have a public health benefit. That principle was wrong at the time it was signed. We already knew, for example, that public health benefited from snus in Sweden, where now the rate of smoking is 7%, 5% daily. It's the lowest in the world, and the reason is because of snus. And because of that, there is a lower level of heart disease, cancer, and respiratory illness in Sweden than there is in comparable countries. So that principle got off to a very shaky evidential start, but it's become, I think, totemic. Now, just one thing to say about this. I don't think it's the governing principle of tobacco control because it is written into the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. I think it's written into the Framework Convention because it's the governing principle of tobacco control. It's what the people interpreting that article wanted it to say. And it's how they were able to express their perspective on the tobacco industry in convention language in the form of these guidelines.
So it was a pre-existing prejudice.
I think so. I mean, it's very difficult to prove this, but I think when you look at who was involved in this and who is still involved, I mean, these are veterans of the tobacco wars. So they're people, a bit like me, who spent their, a good chunk of their career fighting the tobacco industry, beating them into submission over the links between smoking and cancer, and all the lies they were telling, and all the kind of terrible conflicts and influencing strategies that they had. And, they just never wanted to really give up fighting that war. And, to some extent, that's right. I mean, you have to be vigilant. I'm not in any way saying that these companies are angels, far from it. But to have a principle that is total, fundamental, irreconcilable conflict, whatever they do now and ever, I think is just setting yourself up for trouble, because you have no way of understanding what innovation might come. I mean, when this was agreed in 2008, vaping was very much in its infancy. Heated tobacco products were just sort of ridiculous sideshows. They were all about the size of a 1980s mobile phone. They were huge things. You cannot anticipate how things will develop, or the idea that it might be the tobacco industry and the vaping industry. And remember, for some tobacco control people, there's no difference. Vaping products are tobacco products. The vaping industry is the tobacco industry. WHO has tried to smear that definition itself. But what you foreclose is the idea that through innovation, the tobacco industry and the vaping industry may be the way you get out of the problem of smoking. And the problem, the disease problem, the health problem, is overwhelmingly caused by smoking. There's also a large element that's caused by really poorly made smokeless tobacco products in Southern Asia. And again, there's a harm reduction agenda for those. You could make them in a much better way, you can make them with much higher purity standards, much better curing, much better processes, and you could save thousands of lives and avoid millions of cancers. So I think it's a ridiculous thing, but it does explain a lot of what we see from tobacco control.
So Clive, when looking at 2008 guidelines here, what are the mechanisms that are the most egregious? Now, we know, and we just had a Canadian activist on who was talking about being ostracized by the Canadian Public Health Association at an event just 2 months ago in September, where a whole whack of harm reduction activists that are involved in the vaping industry got disinvited. Well, not disinvited, but they got their registration yanked and they weren't able to attend this conference. So, they are being ostracized from the public discussion. Is that the same thing that's happening across the world as a result of this article?
I think there's an element of that. I mean, this principle, if you apply it rigorously and you say, right, that really is our governing idea, a lot of bad things flow from it. So, for example, if you support tobacco harm reduction and the value of reduced risk products from a public health point of view, then somebody who rejects that idea has to see you as somebody who is fundamentally misguided or a shill or in the pay of the industry or in some way influenced by something outside of their governing principle. Now, that I think has led to a polarization of debate. And, I would happily debate anyone, anytime, in any forum. I'm all up for that. But what you see increasingly is sort of weird purity standards being applied that say, you can't come to this meeting if the following, 8 conditions apply. If you've ever advocated for these products, or you favor low levels of regulation of these products, or you're not pressing for the strongest possible regulation, is one of them I saw recently. Well, what if you think pressing for the strongest possible regulation would make these products difficult to access, more expensive, less appealing, and therefore would lead more people to smoke and fewer people to switch? I mean, which is what I think. So you start to see this way of that group who are bound really together by this governing idea of hostility to the tobacco companies, sort of having an in-group, out-group dynamic and finding ever more elaborate ways to stop themselves being exposed to seditious ideas, or as they would see it, ideas that can only be influenced by the tobacco industry. And I see this all the time on Twitter. But if you look at some of the conference policies that there are now, they're bizarre in the extent to which they, apply purity tests and, try to exclude dissonant voices from their meetings. And I think that's only one of the harmful effects. I mean, but that's pretty harmful.
And we're talking about professionals inside the public health industry who may be amenable to vaping as a tool for harm reduction, and they're being disinvited and shunned and so forth. Is that not correct?
Well, to some extent, I just think those environments are being made more and more hostile, more and more difficult to attend. You'll have things like you would be excluded for the following reasons, but not these. This list is not exclusive. So if you want to go to a conference, you have to turn up there. Hope that somebody's going to let you in. Otherwise, you've wasted your travel and your hotel costs, and you just sit in your room and watch the TV. So it's not black and white, but it's certainly not as it should be, in my view. They should recognize that hundreds of scientists actually accept this idea worldwide. It's a very credible basis. Harm reduction is a credible basis across the domains of public health. There's good evidence, maybe contested, but there's good evidence. And we should have a proper talk about it. We should have a proper debate about it, and we should try to understand each other better. But creating echo chambers and bubbles doesn't do that. And, this sort of terror that you will allow a tobacco industry influence, no matter how tenuous, into the room, I think is counterproductive.
Have you ever been denied attendance at any event or so forth because of?
Well, not strictly speaking. There are events that I've not gone to because it's unclear before you go whether they'll actually let you in or not, depending on how they interpret their own rules. So I'm kind of I'm not going to fly to Berlin turn up, book a hotel for 3 days, turn up on the off chance that they'll let me into a conference. So it has a chilling effect rather than an excluding effect. So, I mean, that's probably their intention. But, they don't write their guidelines in a way that are unambiguous. And, you don't know what they're going to... I mean, I think I'd be fine, but I just don't want to waste my time and money attending something and then have to have a row at the entrance about whether I've met their purity tests or not.
We're talking about the World Health Organization and their Framework Convention for Tobacco Control is really obviously the governing principle here. They're the home of the principle, correct?
Yeah, I mean, institutionally and legally, that's true. That's where that is based. But of course, member states have signed up to the principle, those who are parties to the convention, and many of them act on the guidelines. But as I say, I think this is a broader phenomenon. It's in the guidelines because it's a governing idea in tobacco control. It's a governing idea in tobacco control because it's in the guidelines.
And so this is really, in response to the decades in which that big tobacco did play kind of a detrimental role when it comes to truth on the issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, its origins are in the tobacco wars, and there are many people fought fine and determined battles over many decades with the industry over their sort of lying and cheating and influence operations around smoking, and I'm one of them. I don't make no apologies for that. I did my best when I was director of ASH to try and rein them in and make their lives as difficult as possible. However, you have to be open. If you're focused on public health, you have to be open to the idea that the world changes, that there are innovations, that there are different ways of doing things, and not just reject them because you're always have been in a war with big tobacco or anyone selling commercial nicotine. You have to see the opportunities, even if it puts you in an uncomfortable place. And I freely admit it's uncomfortable. You take a lot of, sneering and jeering, but nevertheless, if you put public health first, you have to be open to these ideas and not exclude them because of some defunct principle that never had any evidential basis in the first place and arises because of the priorities of the old school tobacco warriors as they try to come to terms with the 20th century.
Clive, if you could take a moment, could you walk us through the difference between Article 5.3 and the guidelines that were implemented in 2008? So
in 2003, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control was agreed, and it contains an Article 5.3, which essentially says that governments should protect their policymaking process from the vested interests of the tobacco industry. Okay, fair enough. It's a reasonable principle. You shouldn't have your public health policy written by big tobacco. You shouldn't have your climate policy written by big oil, and you shouldn't have your healthcare policy written by the pharmaceutical industry. Fair enough. Everybody should protect their policymaking process from vested interests. And I would go further and say vested interests of well-funded philanthropists and prohibitionists and anyone with absolutist positions. You need to keep them a little bit at arm's length, listen to them, but don't allow yourself to be captured by them. So fair enough, that's in the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. It's fairly innocuous. There wasn't a lot of controversy about it when it was agreed in 2003. Step forward to 2008, and there is a process which I was not part of. I'd left that field by then, to establish guidelines for the implementation of Article 5.3. And those guidelines are much longer, and they set out a variety of things that you should do, some of which are sensible. You should have transparent involvement with the tobacco industry. Everything should be above board. Shouldn't talk to them just for fun. Shouldn't be involved in marketing or promotion. governments shouldn't be hosting them, in embassies around the world to flog fags to, kids in poor countries or whatever. All good. But the first principle of this guidance is quite eye-popping, is quite extraordinary. And it says there is a fundamental and irreconcilable conflict between the interests of the tobacco industry and the interests of public health policy. Now, that bears very little relation to the principle, the Article 5.3 that it's supposed to be implementing. Article 5.3 is really about process. It's about who you listen to and how you engage with a particular type of stakeholder. But that is a finding of fact. What that says is whatever the tobacco industry says is bad for public health. Whatever they do is bad for public health. Whoever works with them, that's bad for public health. Fundamental and irreconcilable conflict. Not just now, not just when it was signed. If it's fundamental and irreconcilable, kind of means it's permanent. And therefore, it's something that's a profound idea that sort of transcends any idea that there might be innovation, there might be things that change in the future, that mean that there is an alignment of interests between tobacco companies and public health. And what if there was? And actually, we're now living through an era where I believe there is an alignment, at least in some respects, of their interests, which is that they are beginning to market and sell products that are orders of magnitude lower risk than cigarettes, which are, vaping products, heated tobacco products, smokeless tobacco products, and new oral nicotine products like pouches and gum and things. So where does that leave that principle? Where does that leave people like me who think that actually those are very positive developments, even if the tobacco industry and the vaping industry, which is increasingly defined as tobacco industry by many of these advocates, where does that leave us when you think there genuinely is a synergy between the way these companies are evolving and the public health agenda? And it's not as if there's no proof of concept. We've seen tobacco companies, tobacco products make a huge difference to the overall burden of health arising from tobacco in countries like Sweden, where smoking rates are 7%, 5% daily. In Norway, where you barely see smoking now among young women because they're mainly taking nicotine through snus. So where does that leave us if you have this irreconcilable conflict? It really makes no sense, but it has a lot of perverse consequences if you hold to that principle.
And the principle's baked into the cake, into the policy.
The principle is baked into the cake from a legalistic point of view, but more from a cultural point of view, in my view. It's more that is genuinely what is governing a lot of people in the tobacco control field. Not all of them by any means, but if you were to try and pin down one dominant governing idea, it's that the tobacco industry does bad and we're opposed to everything that it does. And once you take that idea and work through the consequences, you end up with being able to explain a lot of the behavior that there is towards tobacco harm reduction.
Now, you just made the point that it's constructed as a permanent truth. And in the article, you make a follow-up point in that it's binding on the future. How is that good policy?
Well, it's not good policy. You should never have a principle that is absolute, unless it's some kind of physical content. I mean, I started this article by using the example from physics that Einstein created the whole insights of special relativity by changing a fundamental assumption, which is that the idea that the speed of light in a vacuum is constant. Okay, now that is true, broadly speaking, and the absolutely incredible findings of special relativity follow from that. And the fact that that wasn't understood before meant that you didn't have Einstein's insights in that way. The problem, and that for all practical purposes, that probably is a reasonable, fundamentally permanent idea. But when you get down to tobacco, human behaviors, markets, products, and everything. There aren't any bright line permanent things like laws of physics that you can depend on quite so reliably. There is no second law of thermodynamics. There is no constant speed of light in a vacuum that you can hang everything off. Conservation of energy and mass. Those things don't really exist in the more social and economic and human health world.
You made 6 points with regards to the principles. Let's take them one by one. And that's the irreconcilable conflict principle distorts science.
If you believe that nothing good ever comes from a tobacco company or the products made by a tobacco company, you have a massive conflict with respect to examining the science about those products or the findings about them. And you use the example of snus. There are still people that deny that snus is responsible for huge public health benefits in Sweden. And that's because they cannot bring themselves to accept that those benefits are there because of a tobacco product marketed by tobacco companies. Just can't do it. But when you take that idea forward and look at the science that we have of, say, vaping or heated tobacco products, you see similar things. So you see that FDA, for example, declared that heated tobacco products like IQOS were appropriate for the protection of public health. And they authorized a claim that said that these products have very much lower, cause very much lower exposures to toxicants than cigarettes, as a reduced exposure claim. Tobacco control people went crazy. You saying, can't say that. It's not a health claim. It doesn't prove that there's any, health benefit. Even though in the detailed documentation, FDA says you're only allowed to make these reduced exposure claims if we're pretty confident it's going to lead to reduced morbidity and mortality. Okay, and it's just that it takes many years for health effects to develop from reduced or not to develop from reduced exposures. So you don't want to wait 5 decades for all the numbers to be in. Before you can start talking about the health impacts. So they allow reduced exposure claims, but there's been denial about that from the tobacco control lobby. Other things, you see clinical trials coming in showing that vaping is twice as effective as NRT for quitting smoking. Now, I'm the first to say that the RCTs, the randomized control trials in which these measurements are based, only tell part of the story. But suddenly people in tobacco control have gone from, well, RCTs are the gold standard and we don't have any of them, therefore nothing can be said about quitting, to, well, it's all more complicated than that. What about nicotine? People are continuing to use nicotine, so they haven't fully stopped, blah, blah, blah. You see this shifting of goalposts around what the science is telling us and needs to tell us, because they have to maintain the fiction that these products are harmful to public health because they come from industries that they dislike.
And that distorts science.
It completely distorts science, yeah.
So it's almost, in a way, the larger kind of meta-analysis here is that activism and science should not mix.
They should not mix, but they really do. You see this in people who take, almost, I don't know how much of it, but just huge volumes of the world's science on tobacco harm reduction comes from American institutions who are paid, funded by the National Institutes of Health, the various institutes that comprise that, and money from FDA. Now, they, whether they like it or not, they are part of this, I think, governing, or many of them are anyway, not all of them, to be fair, governing principle in which they are trying to find problems. They are trying to find reasons to regulate. They are trying to show that these products are problematic. You hardly ever see research done on the opportunities or the benefits or the success. And if it does come out, it's usually as a a kind of regrettable byproduct for which, a long list of caveats and limitations are added to the paper to fend off giving any kind of positive news. Or if you have a finding that says that there are just lower levels of toxicants in these products, they'll just say lower levels. They won't say far lower levels or 2 orders of magnitude lower levels, because that would be to give the game away, that there really are huge benefits here. So it's immensely distorting on science. You'll always see science from the industry criticized, even though much of it is incredibly high quality. It's impeccably done. They spend a king's ransom doing it. They use independent contractors and specialist labs. But a lot of it, a lot of journals won't publish it because they just assume it's propaganda. And many people will just dismiss it, or it will be dismissed as invalid because of its provenance, which again is wrong. I mean, those companies are producing science to satisfy very skeptical regulators. It's almost always very high quality, not without its lapses, but then what science isn't.
Now, a lot of people that work inside the vaping industry, whether advocates or vapors or retailers and manufacturers, they'd say that, they are being unfairly grouped in with tobacco, that the interests of tobacco, so tobacco industry interests, are not the same interests as the vaping industry. What do you think?
Well, the tobacco industry's interests are definitely more complicated, definitely more murky, but they are not as crude as the tobacco control lobby gives them. I mean, so people will say, well, tobacco industry has interests in holding back developments on vaping, for example. There's some plausibility to that, but actually the problem that they've got is that the market is very competitive. Both from the point of view of their competitors, having their competitor tobacco companies having vaping products. So Reynolds is trying to take market share from Altria through its vaping product line, its Views product line. So the companies are competing like cats in a sack with each other for market share using their vaping products. They're all at risk from vaping products from independent companies who have no tobacco industry links. Vaping manufacturers who are currently independent overnight could become part of the tobacco industry. They could be bought in the same way that Juul was bought. They could go from being these independent freedom fighters to being part of the tobacco industry, or at least having not bought outright, but having, large equity stakes or bought outright. So that position is changing all the time. While the market is competitive, though, everybody has an incentive to produce the best products and to market them as effectively as possible to adults, which is where all the money is, and to push the industry along at the most rapid pace they can. Where actually that goes wrong, believe it or not, is not the tobacco industry. It's the regulators and the public health people. They're the ones that are slowing down this migration by the sort of disinformation campaigns, the Avali misinformation, pretending that it's a bigger factor in COVID than it is, and a long list of falsehoods to do with popcorn lung, heavy metals, diacetyl, brain rot for young people, blah, blah, blah. It goes on and on and on. That's what's slowing down. That's what's protecting the incumbent cigarette trade, not the tobacco industry, ironically. They're keen to move on to kind of a different product platform. They're quite keen to get away from combusted products through a transformation of the consumer base from smoking to smoke-free products. The other thing is regulators. If you pile on the burdens, the vaping companies in the United States have those incredible burdens to face through the PMTA process. Those are regulatory protections to the incumbent cigarette trade. In Europe, advertising bans are protections to the independent cigarette trade. So it's if you want to finger anybody for blame for holding back the migration and protecting the cigarette business. It's the tobacco control advocates and the regulators that have implemented policies that have perverse consequences, not the tobacco industry.
Clive, you made the point already that the ICP, the irreconcilable conflict principle, leads to an amplification of a lot of bad misinformation that's out there. It creates an echo chamber. As well, you made the point that it distorts science and that it stifles innovation. So let me bring these points together into one major point, which is that it shifts the goalposts. And we've seen that with regard to nicotine. Now, all of a sudden, nicotine is the deadly evil here. And that's relatively new in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what's happened. If you have unconditional opposition to an industry and its products, and they produce a new range of products that gets over, not almost all of the objections you had to their previous range of products, then you need some new objections. I mean, that's where this kind of madness takes you, really. And yeah, I think that's the problem. They've moved from, well, it causes cancer, heart disease, and respiratory illnesses, which is where we came in, and what I basically care about. To it's causing nicotine's hooking kids. It's it's addiction. It's now the problem is a drug problem, and we've migrated from a public health enterprise into something that looks much more like the war on drugs. Where essentially a recreational drug is held up as being like the bad thing, and then we go after that. And that takes you to a very dark place. I mean, there's nothing good about the war on drugs, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, aren't those lessons already well learned, and they're just ignoring them?
Well, yeah, exactly. The lessons are out there. They're certainly not well learned. I mean, the ideas of prohibition, of really dramatic state interventions to stop things. I mean, these are live now. We see, in a country of over 100 million smokers, vaping is banned in India, and banned in maybe 35 other countries. That's war of drugs mindset that is driving. That's no public health rationale for any of that. That is, here's an evil industry, which, we'll now liken to, a cartel, and we'll deal with it in the traditional war of drugs manner, which is we'll, in our imaginations, make it go away with prohibitive law. Of course, it doesn't go away at all. Everything about prohibitions just make things worse. The products are supplied by black markets, to poor standards, through criminal networks. There are all kinds of knock-on ill effects from having criminal supply chains and so on. But nobody seems to want to learn the lessons from that, which is ridiculous.
Let's jump to a slide that I've got that we had used when Dr. Derek Yock was on the show just recently, and he's the CEO and founder of the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, which I've got a question about that in a second, because he was, intricately involved with the WHO and Article 5.3. And we had a slide for that episode, which was nearly 50% of the global combustible cigarette market is controlled by governments that claim commitment to the World Health Organization Framework Convention of Tobacco Control, which aims to reduce smoking. So if governments are really the biggest players, governments are big tobacco. So if that's the case, what is the WHO doing with articles like 5.3 that allow seemingly, their member countries to continue along selling poison to people while they're crushing independent vaping as an alternative to smoking?
I mean, you highlight one of the many contradictions about this. I mean, I think what people had in mind was the tobacco multinationals sort of swinging into a country and, sort of buying up a few politicians and, very aggressively using public affairs type activity to influence politicians. But you're right. I mean, tobacco is a very strongly government-orientated approach, and you mentioned the government-owned tobacco companies. But remember, WHO's policy is that at least 70% of the price of cigarettes ought to be going in the form of tax revenue. So governments are very highly conflicted by the tax revenue that they get from this. Now, I think many of them, and I think this is true in Britain, much of Europe, United States, are not. People will laugh at me when I say this. Are not so cynical that they put health ahead of those revenues. They're quite prepared to see those revenues shrink, and I can imagine people sort of chortling as I say this. But my experience is that they are genuinely committed to doing something about the public health aspect, certainly in Britain anyway, and would not stop doing that because of the revenues. Even so, it does mean that there's a huge link between all governments and the tobacco industry. So Derek, I think in that slide has a point, and a point that could go a lot further than he does in his slide.
So Clive, with regard then to Foundation for a Smoke-Free World, it's an interesting position because Derek, when he was at the WHO, participated in the development of Article 5.3. Then some years later, he kind of saw the light in some respects and then ended up working with Philip Morris on developing this foundation, which his goal is to stamp out smoking across the world. And, they're really going at it. But yet now their organization is being ostracized from WHO and as well suffering from some of these same things you're talking about. So, I mean, there's a bit of Schadenfreude going on there when it comes for me, but it's still nevertheless.
I think the Foundation for Smoke-Free World is quite an interesting case study as far as this irreconcilable conflict principle is concerned. I mean, I have been astonished by the ferocity of the opposition to it, which I witnessed firsthand myself at the World Conference on Tobacco or Health in 2018. Quite incredible. I mean, it was like a cult fervor going after this foundation, and that's continued to this very day. But when you look at it objectively, Philip Morris have ponied up $1 billion, 80 million a year for 12 years. They've handed them over to Derek, who's an established leader in public health, and basically said, come up with what we need to do to get out of smoking. The whole orientation of the foundation is designed to put money into the idea of ridding the world of smoking. Now, to me, that seems like quite a good idea. And in this field that is sort of starved of money, that you could go a long way with that. You could do good work. You could set up new trials. You could understand the behaviors. You could find out why it is that people won't switch, what it would help to make them switch, how they could go from, smoking to alternative nicotine to quitting completely if they wanted to. You could do more research on what policies work, what don't work, what have perverse consequences. I mean, you could come up with a rich platform of insight that would help you understand how to get from a world of 1 billion smokers to a world of, maybe less than 100 million or even fewer. And yet the opposition to this is near total. They have done all they can to make it as toxic as possible so that no one will, work with them or take their money and everything. And to be honest, I think they would rather see just, $1 billion in a field on fire, like the KLF did with £1 million. It's almost as if they would rather the Philip Morris shareholders have that money than it was put to a purpose that would challenge their iron rule of the irreconcilable conflict principle. So they've chosen to try to render that foundation ineffective. And to me, that is the most criminal waste of $1 billion if they prove to be successful. In the long run, I don't think they will. I think Derek will deliver really good things with that foundation.
It seems to me that if this situation could be adequately explained to the public, they'd be outraged.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of explaining goes on to the public all the time. There's a constant news flow. The idea that there's a struggle between good and evil, and the tobacco thing. Easiest story for journalists to write, easiest and laziest story for journalists to write. It is good copy. No editor's ever going to hold you up and say, hang on a minute, what's all this about the tobacco industry doing a good job? If you're coming in with, yes, unique evil discovered, doing uniquely new evil things, that's just going to go straight through the sub's desk and onto the front page. So I don't have much hope, but I agree with you. If there were proper investigative journalism about the huge propaganda complex that sits behind this, the Bloomberg funded entities that are just talking this up all the time, not thinking about what they're doing, but just on a kind of robotic program to demonize the industry and anything it does, any products it makes, and everything associated with it, then I think they would be quite horrified. I think they would say, yeah, we were game for the war on tobacco when it was all about cancer, heart disease, and people living in misery with emphysema. But are we really against people finding a much safer way of taking nicotine than smoking, sparing themselves a lot of misery and cost, and actually making their lives better? No, I don't think we really are up for that. So I think they're treading on very thin ice with the public support and the reputational capital they have. The more that they push this principle beyond its actual utility and beyond what it actually meant back in the 80s or 70s.
The position is quite totalizing, isn't it?
It is. It is a total war mentality, and that's kind of how the war was fought in the, in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s. There was this thing called the scream test, which was invented by particularly extreme campaigners in Australia, who basically said, if you do something and the tobacco industry screams, you're doing the right thing. And the scream test is another manifestation of the sort of irreconcilable conflict principle. It's just better expressed in the guidelines to Article 5.3, in my opinion. But it's the same mindset. It's the same mentality. And there's a sort of reverse scream test, is that if you do something or support something that looks like it benefits the tobacco industry, then all the tobacco control people scream and call foul and say, oh, this is a terrible thing, a priori, because the tobacco industry, like it.
So back in the 1920s, when the U.S. instituted prohibition of alcohol, one of the biggest things that happened there was the hypocrisy of the whole thing. That really affected the entire population of the U.S. It basically turned every American in some form or another into a criminal, or to turn and look away. And I just wonder, in some respects, is that this kind of position coming out of WHO and like-minded public health organizations and governments around the world are, in a sense, corrupting people's understanding of right and wrong.
I think they are playing with fire, to be honest, in terms of public trust, public confidence. A lot of the organizations who are doing this have fine reputations that they've built up over, many years. But one thing they need to understand is that a reputation can take decades to build. It can take days or weeks to lose. And the danger is that they overextend themselves into bizarre fake news, and that in the end they'll be found out. We've seen people now saying things, and these are respectable organizations, theory anyway, saying things like, there's no difference in risk between vaping and smoking. That's becoming a commonplace among these groups, or that there's no evidence for any reduced risk of vaping compared to smoking, or various forms of what is blatant misinformation and propaganda. Or you see the groups that have pushed the EVALI myth around as if it applies to nicotine vaping. They've done their damage. They move on now. They've never acknowledged they were wrong, never apologized, never put the record straight, but they've landed their propaganda blow, and now they're off. And we know that many of the public now are completely confused about this. They think that vaping products cause some undescribable lung problem, which they often conflate with popcorn lung, which is another sort of bullshit falsehood story. And in their minds that these things are very nasty and novel and dangerous to the lungs in a way that cigarettes aren't. And you even see people claiming, and I hate to see these things, that vaping is even more dangerous than smoking because of these effects. And yet the people promoting that myth know, or if they are professional, which they purport to be, they should know better. That is not what is going on here. And they're doing this because they simply cannot bear the idea that these products have a role in public health, because any product has to be made by an industry, the tobacco industry or the vaping industry, and they just don't like those industries, end of story, and therefore they can't have good news about those products emerging and circulating.
So it seems to me this is very evangelical.
Oh, I think that's exactly right. Well, I would go further than that. I mean, I don't want to be rude about evangelicals, but I would go into the more of a cultist thing. If you have as a kind of single guiding principle that you push forward as dogma, and it determines everything you do, everything you think, your approach to everything, your approach to other people, your approach to products, your approach to public health concepts like harm reduction, then you're basically part of a cult, especially if you think your underlying idea is fundamental and irreconcilable. You think it's permanent and a deeply etched article of faith, then you're a cultist, basically, and you're nothing to do with public health.
So last question, by the way, that's very disturbing to hear, but so how does this get resolved? So if we're talking about, principles baked into the cake at WHO, guidelines and so forth, isn't it just as simple as getting some new people in the WHO and rewriting, Article 5.3? It should just be that easy.
It's very deep-rooted, this idea. I would say there is a kind of propaganda complex around it that includes funders, supposedly civil society organization that are funded by funders. There is a research mindset driven by problem finding, that is driven by funding in the NIH and FDA coming from them. There are people in the top reaches of tobacco control who've grown up their entire career fighting wars with the tobacco industry and not about to stop now. The new waves are there. There is a ton of money available from philanthropists, from grant providers for continuing to fight this permanent war. It's the easiest story to tell in the media. It's something that the public recognize and latch onto. It's easy to be an advocate if you have an unequivocal, unambiguously evil enemy. It really helps. So none of these things will change just with a change of personnel. However, I do think there are a few leaders in the tobacco control and public health world who could make a difference if they changed their mind or became more open to it. So, people like Matt Myers at Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, Michael Bloomberg at Bloomberg Philanthropies, the people who lead in the Secretariat at the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control and the Tobacco-Free Initiative at WHO. Some of the I think some of the commentators in the media could become much more skeptical and could start to look behind stories that they're reporting a little more firmly than they do. And I'm thinking about publications like the New York Times and the editorial board of the New York Times and Washington Post, and the frankly garbage that they tend to publish about these issues. Those could all be influential things if they were opened up to serious reconsideration. Same with the medical journals. They could take a much more skeptical view of the kind of junk science that flows from here. But many of them are wrapped up in it. The peer review process is compromised by like-minded people. So it's not difficult. It's not easy by any means to dismantle a propaganda complex. It is very strong, very well funded, and it's very, very strongly functionally dependent on each individual component. And it's not going to give up anytime soon.
And let me just ask you this one last one. Would Matt Myers or Bloomberg, WHO, will they invite Clive Bates to sit down for a meeting to discuss these issues?
I wish. I once had this is a kind of a sort of childish fancy in a way. I said, okay, Mr. Bloomberg's got, hundreds of millions of dollars on it. He's a private sector guy. He likes competition. Maybe he should have competitive pitches, a beauty contest, if you would like. And I would like to pitch against, Matthew Myers for $200 million to put the world right on smoking. And let's see who has the best ideas for doing that, me or him. I'm pretty sure I'd win. I'm pretty sure it'll never happen.
Well, there you go. Well, Clive, just stay right there. And thanks again for joining us today on RegWatch. And that is Pleasure. It for this edition of RegWatch. Please head off. Before you head off, please go over to support.regulatorwatch.com. That's support.regulatorwatch.com, and consider making a financial contribution to our vaping coverage. It's easy. Just dig into your wallet and find a few dollars and toss them our way. You'll be happy you did, and so will we. And while online, don't forget to like us on Facebook and to follow us on Twitter. For regulatorwatch.com, I'm Brent Stafford.